be covering mainly from sort of 1931 and also George Doughty's early life up until 1975 when he died. Obviously, there's a lot more to the Doughty story, but I could go on and on talking about that if you were to let me, but I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then we'll have a bit of time for questions, which I might not be able to answer. But my email address will be at the end and you can always email me, ask me any questions you want to, give any feedback, which will be really good. So, I like to show this picture. This was in the throes of the reboxing of the Doughty archive. This was a staged meltdown, don't worry about it, but I was, as you can see, I didn't have an awful lot of room left in the office that I'd sort of taken over. The Doughty archive, you can probably work out the size of the box by looking at me next to it, but there were about 1,500 of those to trawl through, and Mike saying trawling through was a very apt way of describing it. So 1,500 of those, completely unknown what was inside, apart from the fact that we knew it was sort of administrative records of the Doughty group, lots of photographs, lots of memorabilia, etc. So I was employed to work on the Dowty project as an archivist and nothing more. I always say in my talks, I'm not an engineer. It's not that I don't have any interest in engineering, but I have no knowledge of engineering. I've picked up quite a lot in the last few years, become a lot more familiar with the industry. I'm also not a historian, but I do have a lot of interest, possibly genetically, in sort of architecture and railway engineering. But I always say to people who say, you know, why don't you have a background in aviation? Well, if I did, then I'd be going down lots of rabbit holes and getting very distracted. So it's meaning that I can just get on with the job at hand and not have to worry about really having too much of a dedicated interest in what's in the files. So the Dowty archive was until recently the largest uncatalogued collection held at Gloucestershire Archives. We're based in the centre of Gloucester. The archives has been based at an old school site since the 1970s, and in 2016, 17, 18 we transformed it into the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub. And this was as part of a project called For the Record. And this involved Gloucestershire Archives and a lot of different partners all coming together from across the counties of Gloucestershire and South Gloucestershire, so the historic county of Gloucestershire, including one of the partners, Safran Landing Systems, whose Gloucestershire base is actually an old Dowty site between Gloucester and Cheltenham. And one of the projects that the transformation of Gloucestershire Archives hoped to achieve was the cataloguing of the business archive of the Dowty group, because previously we couldn't have done it. It was just too big for anyone to work on as a background task. It had been stored in the archives, safe and sound, since 1998, but there was just not the capacity to make any sort of sense of it, or do what was really what could have been done to it to give it justice in that 20 years. External funding came about with the transformation of the archives, and that provided money for a full-time project archivist for 2.5 years, which was me. And that was to work on not just cataloguing the archive, but reaching out to the local and the wider Dowty community, because there was still a lot of people who were working for kind of descendant Dowty companies and who had retired from those companies in, you know, in the 80s and 90s, who really wanted to get together and share stories and, you know, talk about what they had done and how much the group meant to them. And it became very obvious very quickly that despite everything that happened after the Dowty group was sold in 1992, there's still an awful lot of love for that company. And I always say, if I was to talk to somebody in Gloucestershire now about the Dowty group, they either worked there, or they know someone who did, or they, you know, have a family member who did, or something like that. And that's not confined to Gloucestershire. I'm sure it's the same, you know, in the Midlands, and it was down in Wiltshire where I used to work as well. I told one of my colleagues down there that I was doing this, and she said that was actually where she met her husband. So that was very exciting. So the project ended a couple of years ago, but there's still been so much momentum going on, even despite COVID. The book has helped. But also people are still talking. People are on a Facebook group, they're using a heritage website, which I'll share the details with you later. And I want to jump on that momentum as much as possible. I'm not meant to still be at Gloucestershire Archives, but I've been made permanent, so I intend to carry on talking about it and allowing other people to talk about it as much as I possibly can. So on to the Dowty Group. As I said, the Dowty archive is a huge collection. It's taken a huge amount of time to make sense of it, and I'm actually continuing to make sense of it with the help of volunteers who are legacy volunteers, and also the Dowty Heritage website, which is fascinating. If you haven't looked at it, just search Dowty Heritage on Google. However, it's a business archive, so there's lots of photographs, there's lots of patent records, there's lots of correspondence, lots of legal material, but very little on the Dowty family. So working on the Dowty autobiography was fascinating for me because I was able to find out more about Sir George Dowty, the whole brains behind the Dowty Group. Find out a bit more about him as a person. It was really fascinating to work with his son, who had memories of him. He died a long, long time ago, but there was still a lot of love for him within his family. And I was then able to make a lot more sense of the archive. The two sort of came together a lot better. So they've really complemented each other, and I think the book has been a massive addition to the archive that I never would have anticipated happening when I started here in 2017. In terms of what the archive holds, it's pretty much a standard business archive, just massive. So we've got legal documents, correspondence, as I said, lots of patent files, lots of legal files, lots of photographs and negatives of, engineering thing after engineering thing that we can't identify. And as the time has gone on, we've also taken a lot of oral history recordings from people who used to work there. Lots of photographs have been shared online as well. So it's all, it's all growing. Lots and lots and lots of material from the publicity department, lots of brochures, lots of which I'll be sharing with you this evening because they're just really pretty and they really help to enhance, the story of a Dowty company. We've also got lots of apprentice records, which I will come back to later. Really, this just gives a wonderful idea of what the Dowty Group was doing, how much they were doing. They started in 1931 with basically just Sir George Dowty and 2 colleagues from the Gloucestershire Aircraft Company. And then by the 90s, they had thousands of employees in many, many, many different countries around the world. So, it was amazing that the headquarters were always in Gloucestershire. And it's very nice for Gloucestershire and the local area that we've got such an amazing international company. So the picture on the left of this slide shows 10 Lansdowne Terrace Lane in Cheltenham, which was his first workshop. It was basically a garage with a muse loft over the top, and he went into that muse loft to manufacture internally sprung wheels for the Kawasaki company, which was his first major order. He'd been working on various inventions since he started his career in the 1920s, but financially he had to be very careful with what he could take on. But he was finally able to manufacture these wheels for the Kawasaki company, rented this place to do so, and everything went from there. He wrote in his memoir, "The only equipment I had was a workbench with a hand-operated pillar purchased for £3.15 and a piece of plate glass to serve as a surface table. I worked night and day making production drawings, ordering materials and placing orders for the machine fittings. I employed 2 men who worked in the evenings assembling the wheels, and they agreed to be paid when I was paid." He would always say that he couldn't really start his business without some very hard-working people who supported him, he basically did it from nothing. So this is an early product on the left, an advert for the Glourcester F730 with Dowty internally sprung wheels. That was one of his earliest orders. And the picture on the right, it's a bit blurry, I think, is a few of the early employees working at 10 Lansdowne Terrace Lane in Cheltenham, which didn't last long as a workshop because it was basically too small, but it was a really good starting point for it. So prior to the Kawasaki order, he'd managed to produce some shock absorber struts and describes their manufacture by one of his first employees, who was called Joe Balstead. He says, "The parts for these struts were machined on a foot-operated lathe by Mr. Balstead, who was to be one of my first employees, in the cellar of his house. It is difficult to understand how these units ever came to be flown in, for they were not covered by Aeronautical Inspection Department release notes. In fact, I probably did not know such notes existed, and apparently nobody cared. Those were happy days." I must say his autobiography is extremely funny if you haven't read it. He was quite sarcastic. So this is another blue plaque. This is a plaque that was put on the house where he was born, and this was in Pershore. So he was born in Pershore to William and Laura Dowty, and he was born on the 27th of April 1901. He was the youngest of a family of 7 alongside his twin Edward, who was almost identical to him and who was to be a great help to him in his early career. His memoirs regularly refer to his brother, who unfortunately died in a car accident in 1945, and the loss of his twin affected George greatly for the next 30 years until he died in 1975. From his book, it's clear that he missed him greatly and held him in high regard. The similarity in looks between the two brothers allowed them to play practical jokes in school, swapping identities, but they were actually very different people in terms of careers. So Edward Dowty was a designer, and when George started his career in engineering, he created brochures for his brother's products and also printed them. So although they led very different career lives, they were able to help each other. However, as I said, in 1945, a great tragedy occurred, and he writes, "We were both travelling to London by car with Sir Roy Fedden, Dick Spires, our chief service engineer, and my chauffeur Oliver, when some miles before Oxford we were struck sideways by a heavy army lorry out of control. It hit our car sideways, pushing it off the road and down an embankment. My twin brother sitting on the outside took the full force of the impact." So he was taken to the Oxford infirmary, and George went home because he wasn't that badly injured, but unfortunately he was then told that he needed to return to the hospital to see his brother, but sadly didn't make it to see him alive. And he writes in his memoirs, "The loss of my identical twin was a most terrible shock. We had grown up together, we thought alike, we spoke alike, and had the same characteristics and mannerisms. Our lives were uncannily similar. His loss affected me greatly, and after 30 years his memory is as strong as though he was still alive." Now, Edward Dowty, apart from being a designer, was also a pianist and organist, and one time he was organist in Pershore Abbey, so he was later buried there, had a memorial service there. And a few years later, George was to install an altar rail in the abbey in memory of his father, which I believe is still there. So if you are ever there, then please go have a look at it. George Dowty was, quite surprisingly, the only member of his immediate family to take an interest in engineering, but his father was still a great pioneer in his own right. But George took an interest in how things worked from a very early age, and this was partly to do with his father, but also other family members as well. At the age of 11, George started experimenting with magnesium powder used by his father for his developments in photography. He set light to a bottle of powder and it exploded in his face, causing him to lose his right eye. Despite this setback, he continued to be very good at sports and, of course, extremely detailed engineering drawings. And you never would have known, his son said he would never cry about the fact that he only had one eye, and he just got on with life. And you wouldn't have known that he had one for the work that he was able to carry on and do in his career. A year after that, his father died of a stroke, leaving his mother with 8 children and, unfortunately, not much capital. But luckily, some of George's siblings had already left home and had formed careers for themselves. His older brother returned home to look after the family business, and then George found a new father figure in his brother-in-law, who was sadly killed during the First World War. But his brother-in-law, Sidney, was the person who really got him interested in engineering. He gave him a model steam engine and a book called The Wonders of the Engineer. And he writes in his memoirs, "Nowadays, a child's creative talents can be inhibited by the wealth of ready-made toys. But in my case, necessity was the mother of invention. I can remember how I contrived a miniature set of fairground gallopers operated by the steam engine, making use of an old umbrella frame. Making toys stimulated imagination and initiative, and no doubt helped me in my inventiveness." Sidney was later to give George a model aeroplane, around the same time he saw his first real-life plane, and from there his love of aircraft, which continued for the rest of his life, was born. So although Doughty was born in Pershore, he moved around several times before coming to Cheltenham and working at Sunningend Works, which is now the Lansdowne Industrial Estate in Cheltenham. He was also at evening school in Worcester. It was during this time that he began reading and writing papers for the Institute of Aeronautical Engineers, and this was when he was trying to get his name recognised, and that was in his early 20s, so still very, very new in his career. Some of the earliest documents we have in the Dowty archive are copies of letters between him and various companies that show his passion and his intent to get his early patents and inventions registered and protected, and if possible, get the products made on a budget. He had to work very hard to get this achieved, and he had a lot of setbacks. And it would take several years before the first order from the Kawasaki company that I described earlier. He actually set up his first company, the Aircraft Components Company, while still working at the Gloucestershire Aircraft Company, because he needed the ongoing salary to come in while he was trying to make his new products. So he really did work very hard on trying to get these products made. The letters that I mentioned are the earliest documents in the Dowty archive, apart from, quite randomly, some 18th century deeds of land in Tewkesbury, which I was a bit confused about until I realised that they later became the site of the Dowty factory. So I like to say that the Dowty archive starts in 1735, but it doesn't really. During George's teenage years, he worked in a factory in Worcester and, as I said, also attended evening classes in mechanical engineering. Between 1918 and 1919, he developed his first proper interest in aircraft. His varied experience in the aviation industry, accumulated by that time, had made him critical of the way things were being done. He often found fault in things and he always wanted to improve, and that was to last for the rest of his life. His knowledge and his learning meant that by the time he got a job at AV Row in 1920, and don't forget he was only 19 at this point, he was regarded as the undercarriage expert there, and he designed the undercarriage for the plane that you'll see on the slide in front of you for the Avro Aldershot at the age of 19. So that's what he was doing at that age, which is not what I was doing at that age. In the next few years, he was to make a name for himself as an undercarriage expert. And when he got his job at the Gloucestershire Aircraft Company at the age of 23, he'd already written several papers for publications on how to improve their designs. The chairman of the Gloucestershire Aircraft Company was called Alfred Martin, and he would become instrumental in George's success a few years later. In the years after his first proper order from the Kawasaki company, more orders began to arrive for parts slowly but surely. He just had to be patient. He began to make his name more widely known, he started employing more staff, he started pouring more capital into his business. He left Lansdowne Terrace Lane and rented a place in Grosvenor Place South in Cheltenham, and in 1932 he changed his company name to Aircraft Components Limited. The annual turnover then was £2,800 and there were 5 employees. A year later, the turnover had risen to £5,000 and there were now 11 employees. And within 2 years, the company would expand into one of its most prolific premises, Court in Cheltenham, which you can see on the slide. And in 1940, he finally gave his name to the company, calling it Dowty Equipment. And it was continued to be a Dowty name for the rest of his life and many years after. By the time Dowty Group Limited was formed in 1954, and this was to combine all of the different Dowty companies, the company as a whole employed over 13,000 people worldwide. So that's only 23 years after it was first established. Early records of the Aircraft Components Company and Dowty Equipment show the development of the company as well as the employment of its staff. In the archive, we hold engagement forms and salary books for personnel, legal documents relating to the formation of the company, business registration forms, sales ledgers and order books. This was all happening in Cheltenham, from the first premises in 1931 to the premises in Grosvenor Place South, then to Bath Street in Cheltenham, and finally to our court, which was in the previous slide, which was the company's headquarters for nearly 60 years. So I mentioned a few minutes ago Alfred Martin, who was Dowty's former employer at the Glourcester Aircraft Company. He was able to finance the purchase of our court, which everyone always says, and George Dowty also said, really helped, and he wouldn't have been able to do as much as he could with his company if it wasn't for the purchase of this property. So he was able to purchase this with the finance from Alfred Martin in 1935. Martin then went on the board of the company and continued to finance it, enabled it to expand and move to these larger premises and build the factories that were to be next door to it for decades. Initially, George wanted to build a new factory on the outskirts of Cheltenham, but he was told he couldn't by the council. But luck was on his side because he was able to find our court. Our court was a mansion with 80 acres of ground and 8 cottages, with the present building constructed in 1834. It had been deemed too large for a private residence at that time in 1934, so it was being sold relatively cheaply, and the council agreed to Doughty's pursuit of it for a factory. He bought it in 1935 for £6,500. He turned the mansion house into offices, and the outbuildings, stables, coach houses, and garage became homes for workers. As I said, Alfred Martin joined the board as chairman, and George was able to then get some much needed loans from banks, which enabled him to purchase the equipment that he needed to make his products on a much larger scale. So this was to become a massive turning point for the Dowty Group. Elsewhere in Cheltenham, in 1937, another company was to arrive in the area. Rolls-Royce and the Bristol Aeroplane Company formed a joint company called Rotel Air Screws, and they took over the site in Staverton, which is now the Safran site. They were manufacturing propellers and landing gear for aircraft. 20 years later, this company was sold to the Dowty Group, and this was one of its most important and high-profile purchases, pretty much doubling the personnel in the Dowty Group itself. So George Dowty started his company in 1931, 8 years before the start of World War II. By the time the war started, the company had become well established, and contracts were awarded for lots of different aircraft. However, when the war started, the requirements from the Dowty companies grew. Aircraft components began subcontracting and took on huge numbers of orders very quickly. And Dowty writes in his book, the placing of contracts, the allocation of materials, the day-to-day liaison, the settling of innumerable queries, all these were controlled effectively from our court, such that at the end of hostilities we could claim the unique record that not a single aeroplane throughout the war years had ever been grounded for lack of a Dowty spare. We do have a few documents, not many unfortunately, but a few, relating to the war in the Dowty archive. Arguably the most interesting of these is a very small notebook. It's really, really tiny. This was written by George Dowty himself, and it shows the growing numbers of orders, sales and overheads from 1938 to about 1946. And you can see in the slide the massive growth that the group had just around the time of the Second World War. Then it went right down, and then it started to grow again towards the end of the 1940s. So the notebook shows that the company was still making money and getting a name for itself even after World War II, but it did definitely need to pick itself back up. And Dowty was not, his son always says he wasn't a businessman, but I really think he was. He knew how to grow his companies in industry and geographically during the war. He knew how to make the most of what he could offer to the war effort and also what he could offer to people once the war had finished. He continued to invent improvements to aircraft, but during the war he also started repair work, taking on a new factory in Ashchurch for the purpose of taking crashed aeroplanes, reconditioning them and putting parts back into the production line. This factory in Ashchurch was the first of many in the Ashchurch and Tewkesbury areas. Many others would soon be built, and many thousands of people would be employed in the area, for companies such as Dowty Mining Equipment, Dowty Seals and Dowty Electrics, and this was to really be when he started to diversify. The Ashchurch factory, which you can see on your right, had previously been a Bird's custard powder factory, and Dowty employed many of the former employees of Bird's, about 40 girls, who had been previously making custard powder. He writes in his memoirs, in order to give them some preliminary training, we persuaded the engineering department of Cheltenham Technical College to take them for a 2-week course. But no sooner had they arrived than we had a call from the head of department saying these girls were wrecking the place and quite out of control, and we must take them away. We only had 2 educational films to show them, and at the end of the fortnight we could say that we had the only 40 girls in the world who could pack custard powder and read a micrometer. In 1944, just before the end of the war, Dowty took out a patent for the bonded seal, which was to become one of his most successful products. And Dowty Seals, which started life in Cheltenham but quickly moved to Ashchurch, does still run in the Ashchurch area as a company called Trelleborg today. It's still making the same seals that Dowty was patenting 70, 80 years ago. After the war, he also grew his seals business, moving it to Malta creating the company Malta Rubber, which was at one point the largest individual employer in Malta itself. During the war, Doughty's business and other businesses providing industrial help with the war effort were not allowed to make profits in the war. Therefore, the company came out at the end of the war with no more capital than it had before the war started. However, the shrewd businessman that he was made sure that his company utilised the techniques and knowledge that had developed in the years before the war ended. He writes in his memoirs, "I well remember that then many aircraft companies went into abortive schemes on which they lost heavily, but surely, I thought, we had accumulated under the stress of war a kind of wealth which could not be taken away, a wealth of knowledge. It was then that we looked to see how we could profit from the techniques we had developed. We thought of ways in which this knowledge could be applied to other industries." And he was always doing this. He was always trying to improve his workforce and create jobs for them and be able to profit, not himself, but for other people to profit from the huge amount of knowledge that was gained throughout the war years and beyond. So from this, basically all of his businesses grew rapidly. Developments in the seals business and mining and hydraulics, as well as the landing gear that he originally started with. He set up Dowty mining equipment and Dowty auto units, which was later Dowty hydraulic units in 1948. And he also set up a company in Canada, which his later chairman, after he died, the chairman, Robert Hunt, who was sent to Canada to take charge of the company there. So I've already mentioned the Staverton Company Rotork Air Screws, which, as I said, was established in 1937. Doughty was approached in 1958 by Lord Hives, who was the chairman of Rolls-Royce, to see if he would take over the company, which he did in 1959. The document on the left is a good example of a lot of legal documents that we've got in the Doughty archive. This is the Memorandum and Articles of Association of Rotork Air Screws Limited from 1937. And we've got a lot of documents like that for many of the Doughty companies before they were the Doughty companies. So we've got them for Bolton Port Aircraft as well. He also took over a company in Wiltshire called New Mendip Engineering Company, which was based in Atworth in Wiltshire. And he bought this in 1951 and a few years later renamed it Dowty Fuel Systems. By 1969, Dowty Fuel Systems in itself had over 1,000 employees. And it's probably the company which is best represented in the Dowty archive, because so many of the former employees of Dowty Fuel Systems have loads and loads of technical publicity, lots of photographs of products that the fuel systems companies had. So it's really nice to see so many of these being represented in the archive. One of the things that the Dowty Group did with a huge amount of success was create a really good apprentice scheme. Many of Doughty's apprentices came to the company at the age of about 16 and stayed, some of them for decades, some of them for just 3 or 4 years. One of his apprentices from 1935, who was Robert Hunt, as I said, later became his deputy chairman and then chairman after Doughty's death in 1975. George Doughty was a huge supporter of the apprentice schemes and also the pension scheme, and those who remember him always say that he treated his workers, young or old, very well. He writes in his memoirs, "From those early days I have taken the keenest interest in the education of young men. The apprentice system, now almost unknown in other countries, has served my companies well, and I am proud of those men who, coming to us in their early days, have made good and reached top positions in industry." But he was often disapproving of people coming into the business after receiving a degree, which is quite interesting considering what's happening at the moment with the rise of apprenticeships again. He writes in his memoirs of a time when he visited Cambridge University to see their engineering department, when he was being encouraged to take in young graduates from there. And he was shocked by the standards that were being taught in comparison to in a technical college. Across several paragraphs in his book, he writes, "On entering the engineering shops, I was shocked to see such great untidiness. Had they been my shops, the manager would have been promptly sacked. Certainly the workshops of the North Gloucestershire Technical College were a model compared to the machine shops at Cambridge. Men of 20 years of age were engaged in making bench vices, work done in modern secondary schools by boys of 14 or 15. Others were working in the carpentry shop. Even our apprentices do not go into the carpentry shop unless they are trade apprentices. I did not know that men spent their time at university doing these things. Passing into the laboratories, I was surprised at the elementary equipment. In one section, there were 6 sets of equipment for doing simple crippling of flat plates, work I did at night school at the age of 16. The drawing work being undertaken was similar to that in a secondary technical school by boys of 14. The work I saw at a Cinderford school some months before was every way as good as the drawings being done at Cambridge. He later writes, "When I showed the report on this visit to Sir Roy Fedden, he said, 'You've seen nothing. Go to Oxford.'" When writing in 1975, Dowty says that they have 700 apprentices at any one time. The Dowty archive holds several hundred apprentice indentures, record cards, and correspondence files about various apprentices engaged by the Dowty group. They went to several different companies within the group, including, even beforehand, Bolton Port Aircraft, which were taking in apprentices in the 1950s, as shown by these pictures. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now just discussing the 2 businesses that I see as very important in the Midlands area. Bolton Port Aircraft of Wolverhampton, which merged with the Dowty Group in 1961, and the Mining Engineering Company of Worcester, which merged in 1954. Bolton Port Aircraft was present in the UK before the First World War, but started making aircraft for the war effort in 1914 under the name Bolton and Paul, having previously been a bigger name in construction rather than aviation. Once the war was over, the company started building their own aircraft and continued to do so after that name until 1934, when the aviation business was sold off from the main construction business and moved to Wolverhampton from the company's original location in Norwich. In 1934, when it moved, it became known as Bolton Port Aircraft and then gradually became known more as an aircraft manufacturer in that area rather than construction. One of the names most associated with Bolton Port Aircraft was John Dudley North, the chief aircraft designer for the company, and his name crops up a lot in the Dowty archive as a holder of patents and also someone who had a lot of correspondence with Sir George Dowty. He was actually responsible for the merger between the Dowty Group and Bolton Port Aircraft because he was already good friends with George Dowty, and he suggested to him that he might like to take it over, which he did in 1961. It was a member of the Dowty Group of companies in its own right until 1970, when it changed its name to Dowty Bolton Port and continued to be in that company right up until the 90s. The company was well known for its aircraft component and entire aircraft manufacturing, but also made, among other things, in this picture, body panels for the Austin Healey, which is rather beautifully shown in this photograph. The company was also more involved than other Dowty companies in the development of the Concorde, which you can see in the order sheet on the left. And on the complete other end of the scale, I was very fascinated to find this brochure advertising pressings with food trays, which they were also involved in the 60s and 70s, I think. So in the Dowty archive, we've got an awful lot of photographs of the factories in Wolverhampton and also some of the products that were made. And this is either photographs of products that have been created for publicity documents or the brochures in their own right. So you'll find an awful lot about Dowty Bolton Port products in the Dowty archive and also Bolton Port aircraft products, as well as legal documents such as contracts and the development of the company in the 1930s as well. So I've just found a few of the more interesting photographs, but if you go onto the Dowty Heritage website, you'll find an awful lot more that you can browse through, and obviously if you wanted to come in and have a look at them here, you'd be very welcome as well. So this photograph shows the plating workshop, the inspection and testing department. My favourites that I found on the Heritage website, which does, I don't think this is actually from the Dowty archive, this is a community contribution. It shows a group of female workers and they all worked at the site. I guess they were doing something fun, I'm not sure what it was. So in the Dowty archive, we also have documents that can help provide the history of a company, such as site plans. I really like these site plans. I'm sure any design engineers do as well. Drawn up in the 1970s and 80s, these site plans show the development of the Dowty sites that grew up in those decades, and we have them for Dowty Bolton Pool. This particular photograph is of the clubhouse and sports field in Codsall. And as I said, we also have a lot of publicity in the archive, lots of brochures, data sheets, magazines produced by the group and its subsidiary companies, just like Dowty Bolton Pool. However, I also discovered when looking through the Dowty archive that the Dowty group was associated with Wolverhampton in less exciting ways as well. So this photograph shows the aftermath of a plane crash in 1970 on the 9th of April. It was an aircraft owned by Dowty Group Services, and it was travelling to Penderford Airport from Luton to pick up passengers for a flight to France. But unfortunately, it was experiencing difficulty landing because of poor weather conditions, and during the third attempt to land, the aircraft sadly struck a house in Redhurst Drive, about 600 yards from the aerodrome. It sadly caught fire, and it devastated the house that it hit, killing the 2 pilots on board and also the occupant of the house, sadly. Must have been a massive shock for the Dowty company and for the Wolverhampton area. It may well be something that people remember from the Wolverhampton area. So I'm just very quickly going to mention the mining engineering company of Worcester as well. This company was originally based at Moorfields near Sheffield, and it was founded in 1909 as a major subsidiary company of Higgins Boton Industries. The company specialised in mining rescue apparatus and actually won an award in about 1911, I think, for some breathing apparatus for mining engineers. And it also specialised in making conveyors, such as the one you see here. It moved to Worcester after the company expanded in 1925. By 1961, they employed 650 people in the Worcester area, and in 1968, they were acquired by the Dowty Group. As I've already mentioned, the Dowty Group had a company called Dowty Mining Equipment, and they were very interested in developing this, so it was quite natural that they would try and purchase similar companies, and the purchase of MechE with the purchase of its parent company seemed like a natural progression for them. And as far as I know, it went very well. It continued to do very well over the next few years. MechE became Dowty MechE in 1979, finally taking on the Dowty name. But just 10 years later, it was one of the industries hived off by the Dowty Group as part of the slimming down of the types of work they were offering. So very sadly, the mining and hydraulics companies went first. I just want to finish this talk by speaking a little bit more about how well George Dowty was received. So in 1954, he was made an honorary freeman of the boroughs of Cheltenham and Tewkesbury, and this photograph shows him signing a document with the mayor. Just 2 years later, in 1956, he was honoured with a knighthood. He was delighted with it, but in his book, he expresses his displeasure with the lack of honours given to people for services to industry. He writes that in 1956, not one of the knighthoods awarded were for services to industry. Not even his. His knighthood was actually for services to the disabled. And this was because he joined the board of Remploy, Bristol, in 1955 and successfully got members of that company into factories. That's what he won his knighthood for. Also in 1955, he was awarded the Gold Medal for outstanding achievements in the design and development of aircraft equipment by the Royal Aeronautical Society, which he was also a president of at various different times, the whole society and the Gloucester and Cheltenham branch. He died in 1975, not long after he wrote his memoirs, and his company continued for nearly 20 years after that. In 1992, the company was sold to TI Group, and that was when conversations with Gloucestershire Archives, where I am, about the transfer of the archive to Gloucester started happening, and this finally happened in 1998. The company that Sir George Dowty left in 1975 was one that had implanted itself into countries throughout the world. Among others, industries represented by Dowty Group companies included mining, hydraulics, rubber products, communications, electrics, marine, nuclear, and of course the aviation industry where it all started. There were probably 100 different Dowty companies throughout the 60 years of the Dowty Group, which is a huge achievement. The group's sale in 1992 met with anger from basically all of the employees, and it was certainly a hostile takeover. People saw it as really disregarding the Dowty name. And some of the companies, such as the mining industry companies, were hived off after the sale, which was a real shame. It then started to diminish a little bit more. But we do still have some legacy companies, obviously the legacy companies at Dowty Bolton Pool. We also have Dowty Propellers, which is based not far away from here in Brockworth, which is owned by GE Aviation. And of course we have Safran, which is in the old Dowty Rotor site. So it does still exist, but more in people's memories, unfortunately now. So I just want to finish this talk with a quote from his own foreword to his book. He writes, "I started my engineering business in 1930 with just £50 to my name. Many friends said I was crazy and throwing up a safe job as a draftsman earning £5 a week. But had I possessed £5,000 then, the struggle that awaited me would have been the same. The years that followed were those of the Depression and great unemployment. My lack of money forced me to improvise, to do without, and to operate with the greatest economy. Looking back at this distance, I feel it is no real hardship to be short of cash when starting an independent career, providing you have the stamina to withstand difficult and rigorous times." In Sir George Doughty's autobiography, he reminds us time and time again that his perseverance was key to his success. He was a relentless businessman as well as a very good inventor. And while he obviously did do well out of his business, what I take from his book was always the desire to improve industry, not improve himself, invent new things, diversify, and never assume that something was perfect. Something could always be improved on. This, in my opinion, allowed him to become one of the largest employers in the Cheltenham and Tewkesbury areas. His legacy is everywhere. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, most people in the area worked for the Dowty Group companies or knew someone who did. His work is still being honoured by the legacy companies that do luckily still exist. Many of his employees carried on working for those legacy companies until retirement, some even still do now. And now we have the catalogued archive, the community heritage website, which I will put details of in the next slide, and the published book to continue this legacy and continue the conversations into future generations. I'll just leave this slide up for a little bit. These are my details, so my email address on the top, postal address if you want to visit or write to the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub. The 3 websites that are of interest, so dowtyheritage.org.uk is the community heritage website where you can share your own stories, pictures, memories, even do oral histories if you want to, and then the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub on Twitter and Facebook. So I'll leave the slide up, as I said. Has anyone got any questions? Thank you very much, Mary.